Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemy of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity, with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took their books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphone hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very hefty level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables.
We are opening the door to the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom.
To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response.
We no longer want to be freed.
Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphone began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them in life. The food rations past 5 days had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest stuffed in the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and the angles of the wounds indicated that most of it, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and lain on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of the days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still, many refused to return to the chamber and remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternatively begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count the ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one of the doctors. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word more over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. Their surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility, the 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had given him to prepare him for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one of the wrists, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier was holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subjects that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton was badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in a struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested reluctantly they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so that the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well. Although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation, the surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given.
I must remain awake.
All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, a former KGB agent, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but they were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor, and they had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off the pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if they were repeatedly suffering from brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flatlines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as the 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between his eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. I won't be locked in here with these things, not with you, he screamed at the man strapped to the table. What are you? I must know. The subject smiled.
Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven we cannot thread.
The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out.
So nearly free.
I'm not a thrill seeker. I spend most of my free time in a secluded comfort zone, usually in bed with my girlfriend. Having someone to love and hold is the only thing that doesn't make me feel cold anymore. I'm grateful for it. Truly, I am. Sleep has never been so good for me, and I can't imagine it ever will be if I lose this. Yet, there's no escaping some things. Not for me, anyway. There are nights I wake up and remember it so clearly that I think, just for a moment I return to that place beneath the ice. I can imagine the concrete ground, the thin walls, and the cold steel beams. I can hear the straining ceiling and the distant ruptures. I can only really make sense if I start at the beginning. 4 years ago, I went to the North Pole with a friend of mine, whom we will call Jake. Jake was the thrill seeker. He had the personality, not so much the funds, to pursue the next big thrill. Whenever we had enough cash to fund his latest impulse, he would spend it. It was no surprise to me or anyone that knew him that his relationships were often short-lived. He was attracted to the same kind of people, but impulsive people rarely hold on to their values. He was cheated on many times, and before you feel sorry for him, he cheated on women many times. Eventually, it reached a point where his friends could be counted on one hand. Against my better judgment, I was one of those friends. He called me up one day to tell me about this big opportunity to see polar bears in northern Canada. I was interested. Spending all my life in England, I never went further in this world than Scotland, which turned out to be as equally miserable as the city I was living in. I had free days I wanted to take advantage of, and my life just felt like it was going nowhere. In short, I was feeling weak and impulsive. It didn't take too much convincing for me to bite the bullet. Jake screwed up most of his life, but at least he had some good photos to show for it. I needed something like that to look back on, even if it filled me with regret. "Screw it," I said as I FaceTimed him. "Let's go see some polar bears."
Hell yeah! We leave tomorrow.
What? I need to get tickets.
All covered. A guy I met will fly us there. Only a small stop in Greenland. Then we will bounce to Canada. Or skip, whatever. Pack warm, but pack light.
Oh shit. I think I have some clean clothes. When will you pick me up?
About 2 in the morning.
Jake said as if that didn't make my heart drop already.
Plane leaves at 3:30, so yeah.
Taking the cheap, easy route isn't always legal. The less said about the flight arrangements, the better. I just trusted the fact that nobody would check our passports when we arrived, and luckily, they didn't. I guess if you know people, there are a lot of things that are never checked or recorded. One thing I knew for sure, I would be going back the usual way. The plane we were in was like a small mail plane, just boxes of envelopes in hard cases. It was also cold. No proper insulation, no proper seats. We spent our flight shaking in blankets that Jake's friend gave us. Once off the plane, we were guided through the small airport until we made it into the town itself, free and ready to find transport to our first destination. I let Jake guide me the whole way, and I will say this much, he knew how to make it look like it was all planned. We found a nice place to stay. We saw the polar bears and we saw beautiful mountains and forests. I guess I never really knew anything about Canada. I just imagined cold grey cities with cold grey people.
Nah, that's Eastern Europe. Canada is great. Good food, friendly people, beautiful country. If you go to the right places.
Speaking of which, I said as I looked through the photos I took at the polar bear reserve. Where to after this? I have 2 more free days until I have to go back to work.
Can't you call in sick after that? There's still time to warm up in Mexico, mi amigo.
Jake, por favor. No more sketchy flights. Let's just make the most of tomorrow, then let's head home, okay?
There's nothing really in range, you know? I mean, we could try ice fishing in this cabin my old girlfriend has. Better still, we can rent some snowboards. Go to the...
I will take the ice fishing, thank you. It was chaos. Not being locals, we didn't pay attention to the warning signs or the news. We rented a truck with these chains wrapped around the tires and started our journey towards the cabin. The weather was ballistic and visibility was low. The whole time I was worrying if we would ever make it back to the town we left, let alone the cabin. Jake tried to stay upbeat about it, but it was clear he was worried as well. We turned off real roads into a dirt path through the forest, but that too was getting covered in thick snow. We listened to the radio, mostly country rock, which would only be played in lousy bars. It did little to ease my nerves. I just kept refreshing the news portion on my phone, hoping a connection would get through.
We should be there soon,
Jake said with a smile, turning the truck just in time to avoid a tree.
I recognize this area.
So do I. I've been seeing snow-covered forests for the past 20 minutes. My words must have started it. Light sarcasm to break the camel's back. The truck continued for a few more seconds and then there was a sudden lurching drop. The side of the truck I was on dipped noticeably, then rose before it ground to a halt. I looked at Jake and he looked at me. I sat back as he tried to get the truck to keep going, but it was benched on something and the ground was too slippery. It needed all four wheels in the ground and the back left tire. We both got out of the truck, the sheer wind cutting through our jackets as we walked to the back and examined a large rock. It was jagged, its point pressing against the frame, but not by much. Just need a little lift and it'll get off.
A careful lift. I didn't pay the insurance.
Why do you care? You didn't show them any ID and paid in cash.
I actually did show them my ID. It was necessary, you know?
Jake looked at me nervously. My face felt that much colder. What happened to not leaving a paper trail? I questioned him. There wasn't any time to shout at him. We had to get the truck off the rock. Luckily, the rental place didn't just give us chain-bound tires, which seemed to be clumped up with snow, but they also had gave us a toolkit in the back of the truck. I took the largest piece of metal, a pry bar, and wedged it between the rock and the truck frame. With as much patience as I can muster, I told Jake to pump the accelerator a little so the truck didn't roll back. Being squashed by the red behemoth was the last thing I wanted. So, that's what we did. Being as strong as I was, I lifted the truck just enough so that the two front wheels were able to pull the truck forward. The weight slipped off the pry bar so suddenly that I almost fell forward. The truck dropped. The frame hit the tip of the rock, but bounced forward. Out of sheer fear, I stumbled back. The brutal crunch of the metal rock made my heart jump. I saw the truck and all four tires as I stumbled back. I think I even heard Jake's whooping over the roar of the storm. As my ass hit the ground, I felt an emptiness to my right. I tried to place my hand there, thinking there was ground to keep me steady, but all I did was shift my weight the wrong way. I fell into darkness. I heard the whistle of wind above me, but also the rush around my ears as I fell. I heard the chattering of metal. The pry bar fell with me. A dull thunk. My leg hit something, causing me to twist. Then I hit the ground. All of this happened in the space of a few seconds. Each second I was in such shock I didn't react. And then I couldn't. I woke up to a shooting pain in my right leg that seemed to run up my side as well. My head didn't feel sore, but it wasn't easy getting up either. It felt like my insides was just one fragile piece of pasta, waiting for that pressure to make it all snap. Yet I willed myself to sit up and look around as well as I reminded myself to breathe. With that first inhale, my teeth ached and my tongue was dry. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw I was in a tunnel. The walls and ceiling curved into each other, making this half-moon shape against the flat, concerted ground. Steel struts added to the support and separated the rooms that diverged away from the tunnel I was in. I saw lights far ahead, a glowing speck in the distance. I instinctively reached for my pocket to get my cell phone to use the flashlight, but that was nowhere to be found. I recalled leaving it in the truck to charge. I sat there for a moment, energy fast returning, but all of it focused on my growing panic. I had fallen. I could see the hole in the roof above, but I couldn't see the surface. Water droplets dripped onto me and around me. In a hoarse voice, I called up but received no response. I couldn't even hear the blizzard. What I did hear was creaking and cracking. The panic told me to stand up. My foot bumped the pry bar that fell with me. I picked it up and started walking towards the distant light. The whole tunnel seemed to make those unsettling noises, but otherwise it was silent. My footsteps were the only accompaniment. My eyes searched the darkness for something as I walked, my logic-bound mind seeking something that could help me, like a phone. When I couldn't see one, I started inventing reasons for the tunnel I was in. Old subway? It didn't look like one. Part of the infrastructure, like a sewer or electrical thing. No, that was crazy. It looked too good for either one of those. Old war bunker? I doubt the Canadians built something so large during the war. After who knows how many minutes, I heard something collapse and it shook the tunnel. Looking back, I can make out concrete falling and steel struts snapping and buckling. Right where I sat, the tunnel was struggling and losing, section by section. It was caving in towards me. It wasn't slow to start. I ran for my life. I didn't know how movies could get a sensation so wrong. You don't have time to scream and run. You could only do one effectively, and obviously it was the latter. I ran until I reached the light, the collapse only increasing in speed, catching up to me. I tried to turn the corner sharply, but I only ended up slipping. My head bounced off the ground and fear pushed me to my feet again as I ran down a lit tunnel. The collapse reached the corner, but that's where it stopped. When the ground was no longer shook, when the rumble faded, I looked back to see the wave of dust settle. The way back was gone. I was standing in a new section of the tunnel, which is more like a maze of hospital hallways. The fact that the lights were on made me hopeful, but not as much as the green exit sign hanging from the ceiling in one hallway. Sweating, I took off my huge puffy jacket and folded it under my arm. With the pry bar in my other hand, I started to walk fast towards the way out. I drank from a water cooler. The dust and cobwebs that covered it told me how long the place had been abandoned, yet the lights told me that it still had power. Did those who built the place forget about it? Or was there some long-lasting backup power system? I passed by several empty offices, labs, and even surgery rooms with weird observation rooms above them. I know now that it's common for students and even family members to observe a surgery, but I was thinking of something else in that moment. And when I say these rooms were empty, I mean it. A desk, a few shelves, some tables, and a hospital bed frame and no mattresses were all that filled the space. There is only one exception. The rooms I couldn't get into. these were these keycard protected doors with some heavy duty bars braced against them. Bolts kept the doors together, not screws. On every one was a gas mask symbol. Airtight chambers for different kinds of experiments, I guess. While I searched, I continued to hear the groan of pressure above. At least it sounded much more stable, so I didn't have to worry about a mountain falling on top of me. My only concern was how long it took me to reach the exit. I kept following the signs. I wasn't going in circles. The rooms to my sides were different. I tried not to let my imagination play tricks on me, like making sounds that weren't there, or that I saw people, maybe even a head, staring at me from around a distant corner. That seemed to happen a lot more than I cared to admit. What settled my thoughts was an obstacle. A door with chains, but not on my side. I could see through a narrow window the heavy chains that kept the handle in place and the massive lock that was used. I opened the door as much as I could. It was just enough to fit my pry bar. I looked around, the sound of metal echoed, but I didn't see anything. My hallway to my left, empty. The hallway to my right, empty. The hallway I came from had a single flickering light, and a few of those rooms I couldn't open, but it was empty too. I dug the pry bar and tried to find a good position to use it. I made the mistake of trying some sort of levering to snap the chain, but what worked was twisting it into a tight position first, then prying at a single link. It still took a while, and I worked up a sweat, but the link broke. Gravity pulled the chains down with a clatter. I pulled the door open and stepped into a stairwell. I was at the top. The exit sign was pointing down. No. I remember the word escaping my lips. That was the first thing that didn't make sense to me. Why would the exit be deeper into the facility? I didn't think about it for too long. It was still the only way I could see, so I took it. I started my journey down the steps. I passed several keycard protected doors on my way down. Nothing that I could open. With each one I saw, I was afraid that the exit would be behind another keycard protected door. My descent was gradual enough that I could let those worries slip into the back of my mind. I would say it was close to 50 levels below where I started when the lights turned off. I didn't notice the hum of the facility until it stopped. In darkness, I had to use the glow-in-the-dark strips on the ground and walls to keep me from stumbling. I could still see the keycard protected doors, their card reader screens still running on some kind of backup power because they were lit even then. I was approaching one when I saw the screen shift for a brief second into a green tone before going black, before power ran out completely. A mechanical sound could be heard, and there was the sound of the seal around the door being broken. The door shifted open slightly as the seal broke, but went no further. My heart was pounding. The door appeared so much darker, the yellow gas mask symbol looking a lot more threatening. I became painfully aware of how loud my steps were when I heard something shift beyond the door. My mouth was opened. My breath halted right at the start of my throat. I didn't want to be found. I didn't want to be heard. I didn't feel alone anymore. My jacket made a sound I didn't like, so I put it down, abandoning it completely. While I was kneeling, I also took off my shoes and continued forward in socks. I held my shoes in my left hand, while my right hand held the pry bar like a club. I passed by several more doors, some regular, but locked. I didn't reach the bottom before I found a door with a green exit sign above it, the words themselves glowing in the dark. I looked through the vertical window and saw a glimmer of light. I reached for the handle and pulled it open. No locks. I stepped into a subway system, although a lot smaller. There was no mistaking what I was looking at. a train, a tunnel, and even the crappy tiles that covered most subway walls and pillars. The train sat there, empty with the doors open, but its lights were on. I breathed a sigh. It was the smallest sound, the sound of a door being pushed just a little before the frame stopped it. I turned around to look at the door, more specifically, the window in the middle of the door. A face pressed against the glass, too dark to identify even with the lights from the train. Yet, I could see its eyes, and those eyes told me that it wasn't human. Reflective like some kind of predator. Those eyes were so glossy, yet murky. They reminded me of a fish's eyes. I took a step back, my breathing halted by shock now. I whined as I coughed to breathe. My body never struggled so much to function since I was a kid. It got a lot worse when the creature hit the door. It wanted to get through. I count myself as one of the luckiest guys in the history, and the door was one of those push-pull doors. The sound of its strikes grew louder, encouraging me to move faster as I ran towards the train. Once inside, I saw that the seats and everything were bare minimum. Public transport looked better than what I was standing in. I ignored the fact that it reminded me of the plane I shivered in to get to Canada and just ran towards the controls at the front. The driver's seat was a basic metal chair with a set of flick button controls, levers, and a number system I didn't understand. I played with the dial and the number changed, counting up and down, the lowest being 5 and the highest being 55. I was panicking, my hand dancing above the controls, not sure what to do. I heard something breaking. I don't know if it was the door or the frame it was attached to. I just knew whatever was beyond it was out. I saw a button with the door symbols. I pushed it and watched the train doors shut. The soft sound of the rubber seals meeting was comforting, but not the sound of fleshy thumbs hitting the doors. I turned back to the controls, scanning them again, then noticing a paper stuck to the wall. It was an information stick, mostly torn and rubbed away. I saw rows and scratched out names and numbers. Only one remained, a set of numbers saying 45. It was all I had, so I trusted my life to it. I played with the dial until the number said 45. I then started pulling levers and pushing buttons. I found more buttons on the side of the panel as well. I was cautious about some, but the sound of glass breaking pushed me to take a chance on them. The train hummed to life and then lurched forward. When I turned around, I saw the door closest to me shaking, being slowly pried open. I dropped my shoes and then approached it with my pry bar. Hands curled around the inside of the sliding doors, if they could be called hands. It was like a pair of talons, two dark, bone-like hooks for fingers. With the realization that I was gonna die if I didn't do something, I lifted the pry bar and started beating on the claws. I heard a scream, bird-like. It reminded me of an eagle. It was being drowned out by the sound of the train's grinding wheels. The train sounded like it was struggling. I didn't have time to address it. The door opened a little wider, and an entire arm thrust inside and reached for me. One of the claws scratched the back of my hand. It was trying to grab me, and hitting it with the pry bar didn't work. I shifted the position of my hand and brought the jagged part down towards its forearm. The metal wasn't razor sharp, but still sharp enough to break the scaled skin of the creature. The screeching scream was much louder, and it withdrew its arm. I turned back to the controls, trying to make sense of why the train wasn't going any faster. I then noticed a lever that wasn't all the way up. Pushing it, I realized it was the brake lever, and the train sped up. I heard thumps all along the train going towards the back, and small screams all along the way. I tried catching my breath. The only sounds I heard were that of the train charging onward. I looked back at the controls and saw that small metal slides shifted into place, locking levers and hiding buttons. A digital screen above the dial lit up, and the words, "Destination set." I sat down on the ground, and everything hit me at once. I yelled to let it all out until I was left with small cries that bubbled up with my breathing. I just felt tiny. I was tired, hungry, and sore. Those small cries were my only relief. It was a long train ride, a few days. I found a trash box at the end of the train which contained mostly little, but I found a couple bottles that still had water and stale soda in them. One orange soda bottle that was half full. It tasted awful and made me feel a little sick, but I was desperate. I tried stopping, but it was impossible. I would break the controls before I got them to do what I wanted. I could wait and hope that I was still alive when it stopped. When it finally did, I didn't dare touch any other controls than the one that opened the doors. I stepped out and saw what appeared to be the same station I left days before. I approached the push-pull door, pulling it open, and saw a set of stairs. I climbed the stairs, not seeing any sealed doors. I kept going to the top, following a dark hallway until I came to a set of doors locked with chains. I used a pry bar, the end of which was stained with a black gunk, to break a link. More hallways, more doors, and a feeling of dread setting in my stomach. I then breathed what had to be fresh air. I climbed another set of stairs, then a ladder, finally opening some kind of trap door that was left ajar. My hands touched sand, dry grass, and rocks, but mostly sand. I climbed out to an open desert, a night sky practically shining compared to the dark I had to trudge through. I saw a distant car driving away. A road. I walked towards it. I walked and walked until I was following the road. I woke up in the bed I sleep now. A woman, a brother, and her mother found me on the side of the road. A true, honest, loving family that nursed me to health, and I didn't understand a word they said. They spoke Spanish. I was in Mexico. The train took me to Mexico. No wonder it took so many days. And here I have remained for the past 4 years. I learned the language, mostly from the woman who found me. We grew close enough to make me want to stay instead of returning home. Then, so close that I never wanted to leave. I contacted Jake and told him I was still alive. He visited to make sure it was me. Technically, I shouldn't be here, but I shouldn't have been in Canada, the Arctic, or that underground facility either. I'm happy here. I'm happier than I was in dreary England, although I do sometimes miss it. I'm leaving this experience with you. Maybe with it out there, somebody else can take it off me. Maybe just talking about it like this will be enough to help me escape those nightmares. Her sickness appeared inescapable as it demolished her health. My mother's weaknesses seemed to exacerbate the illness. The discomforting fact about her sickness was that doctors had no ability to determine what was causing it. Slowly and gradually, each day her body began to deteriorate. First, her nails began to snap. Then her hair began to fall in clumps. and now her skin was peeling uncontrollably. It was as if she were being slipped chemo pills. By this time, our house no longer felt like a home. It was transforming into a hospital. First, she had one caretaker, then 2, and now we have 5 in the house. IV bags are strung about her room, and medical supplies are scattered around the house. My mother's bed had become the only place she spends her days. In fact, I haven't seen her leave her bed in nearly a week. An inescapable sense of fear slowly invaded my family's emotions. My days were spent entirely thinking about my mother and attempting to research what her possible illness was. I usually spent much of my time on the internet researching things. I had a natural thirst for knowledge, and in this case, I decided to research everything I could on the internet. However, I had little luck in discovering possible diseases she may have. I would have spent the entire night on the computer, but something drew my attention elsewhere. As I worked on the computer, my peripheries detected something outside. I shifted my gaze to the window and scanned the area in search of abnormalities. I swiftly recognized an obscure figure. Standing by the tree in the woods was a lanky, bony, dark figure. There was little light escaping the reaches of her home, but the minuscule amount that did just barely illuminated the area around this figure. Whatever it was, it stood motionless, just intently staring at her home. I felt rather unsafe and rolled open the window. "Hey!" I exclaimed. However, there was no response. The scrawny figure just remained static, looking directly at me. I felt quite uncomfortable. It was as if he had some agenda or plan and was just standing there, just waiting for me to sleep so that he may execute his plan then. Though it was a tough battle, I finally managed to discover rest that night. The next morning, I awoke in surprise after a terrifying dream. The rusted springs in my mattress violently creaked, and dust jumped from my covers as I shot up in bed. It was almost as if I had been suffocated by my covers. I fought through the mess in my bed to the window. After looking outside, there was no longer any sign of the abstract figure. I was filled with relief as my nightmare had been swiftly proven false. The previous evening, I dreamt of this abstract figure entering my home. While in the house, he was in my mother's room, whispering what sounded nothing far from gibberish. I was eager to discover what I had imagined was invalid. The next day didn't really differ from the recent schedule. Being the summer, I spent the majority of my time outside. I ran through the woods, exploring and venturing my way through the tall oaks. Before I arrived back at home, I noticed a peculiar sight. On the ground lay several strands of hair. This looked somewhat odd, but as I kept rummaging through the leaves, I noticed things only grew increasingly peculiar. Next to the hair lay several teeth. I also found what looked like human flesh. It appeared as if the skin on someone's hand had been peeled off from the bone and muscle. Looking similar to a glove, the piece of flesh leaned on the ground next to the other body parts. I returned home, filled with curiosity. I decided the best way for me to indulge this interest was to research it. I looked up random body parts in the woods and didn't discover much. I continued searching, but like my mother's illness, I found little explanation. However, this would quickly change. I remembered the disturbing, tall, dark figure standing outside my house. I decided it couldn't hurt to look it up. The results I found were quite unsettling. If what I found on the internet was the same sight I had noticed outside my home, my family and I were fucked. As I read through the articles, it stated the man was a demonic presence attempting to take a human form. Through several failed attempts, it may shed flesh or other body parts. It explained these were mere rejections of the natural human body as it recognized its demonic form. It explained, however, it may only take a full human presence after sucking the life out of a current human. Only then will the human parts accept this demonic form. They call this creature the Abstract Man. By this time, I felt disheartened as soon as I realized the height of the situation. This entity was trying to take the position of my mother. Sure enough, I stood from the computer. I gazed out of the window and was greeted by now the unnerving sight of the Abstract Man. He stood there, almost as if he knew of my newly acquired knowledge. He stared directly at me, now closer than ever. His gaze remained unbroken as his face locked on me. I couldn't make out any human in his face, as he had no eyes, nose, or mouth. The scraggly form was totally devoid of color or definition. Now, feeling disturbed, I remained in bed the entire night, worried for when the Abstract Man would strike. I got up every hour to continuously check on his presence. At 2 a.m., he was closer. At 3 a.m., he crept closer still. At 4 a.m., he was at an unnervingly close distance. At this time, I decided I should alert my parents. I woke them and told them of the man outside my home. My father gripped his shotgun and began walking outside. My mother lay in bed in deep slumber. As my father pounded the door open, we both were greeted with a surprising sight. Outside, our lawn remained empty of any presence or entity. I felt embarrassed. I thought maybe I was just seeing things. The following day, my father and mother left for the hospital. Unfortunately, her illness only grew worse. I reserved my beliefs on her sickness due to the fact that little would trust such a ridiculous premise. I sat on my computer attempting to research more on the Abstract Man and discovered more that filled me with an unsettling feeling. I discovered this figure tried to destroy any information on itself quickly after taking the form of its host. When my mother came home from the hospital, I was pleasantly surprised. She appeared to have fully recovered. She walked around the kitchen. Overcome with joy, I rushed to hug my mother. I thought after the disappearance of the Abstract Man, she would easily be able to return to a healthy state. As I returned to my room, I received a telephone call. When I picked up the phone, my heart sank. Eerily, over the phone, I heard a familiar voice speak. Sounding rather weak, my mother spoke.
Son, I love you. No matter what happens, I love you.
She sounded as if she was fighting for life. I tried to respond, but was unable to as I peered over my shoulder. Standing there, I saw whatever this thing was that now resembled my mother. When it opened its mouth, I heard a sound revoltingly unlike my mother. It uttered shrieks and stood staring at me, flourished with hatred. I looked to the door and tried to dart away. This being chased me with inhuman speed and forced me to halt. It snarled in a nasty voice, but I gripped a nearby kitchen knife. It grabbed my other arm and steadily sped its gaping mouth towards my flesh. It was unsuccessful to bite my limb as I jutted the blade into the creature's neck. It fell to the ground, gurgling on its own blood. It shrieked and struggled on the ground. This disgusting conjunction of flesh changed its voice to my mother's. It screamed.
Help me, son! Help!
I looked back at the being, unable to be tricked by it. I pulled the knife from its throat and crawled away on all fours. I would have attempted to stop it, but it was much too quick for me. As it sped away, it made horrible croaking noises. It still ran in the form of my mother. That day, my mother died. I guess there was only enough room for one of her on the planet, and this creature now occupied that spot. The abstract man takes on the forms of many, and still roams this world as my mother. I have no clue of its whereabouts, but, as I said, he will do whatever it takes to destroy information about him anywhere. As a caution to those who hear this, I would recommend you to check outside your window every night. He knows you, and he will at all costs track you down to rid the knowledge of him. If you ever look out your window and you see a tall, dark figure standing, you must pack your bags, throw them in the car, and get the hell out of where you live. If you're lucky, you will have evaded him. If you aren't, well, then, be ready to give up your body. During my childhood, my family was like a drop of water in a vast river, never remaining in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there were fragments in the attic of my brain which belonged to the various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless, chasing after another boy in the backyard of a house in North Carolina, trying to build a raft to float in the creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania, and so on. But there is one set of memories which remains as clear as glass, as though they were just made yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams produced by the long sickness I experienced in spring, but in my heart, I know they're real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, with a population of 643 people. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't see in the 5 months we resided there. In some ways, it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute to my father's place of work. The day after my 15th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was horrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks. Boredom always loomed just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth, because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body. His head, his eyes, his crooked ears, but his mouth was by far the largest. "You look kinda like a Furby," I said as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look.
Furby? What's a Furby?
I shrugged.
You know, the toy. The little robot with the big ears. You can pet and feed them, almost like a real pet. Oh.
Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity.
You don't need one of those. They aren't the same as having a real friend.
I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stopped by to check on me.
I lay under your bed,
he later explained.
I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore.
We didn't do much during those first days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The third or fourth morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face.
I have a new game we can play. We'll have to wait until after your mother comes to check on you because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game.
After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under the bed and tugged my hand.
We have to go to the room at the end of this hallway,
he said. I objected at first as my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission, but Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open. Then he beckoned me to look out at the ground below. We were on the second story of the house, but it was on a hill, and from this angle, the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline.
I like to play pretend up here,
Mr. Widemouth explained.
I pretend that there's a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather.
I want you to try. I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility.
It's a long drop. But that's all part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop. If it were that way, you might as well bounce on a real trampoline.
I toyed with the idea, picturing myself falling through thin air, only to bounce back to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed.
Maybe some other time. I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt.
Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment.
If you say so,
he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following day, Mr. Widemouth arrived holding a small box.
I want to teach you how to juggle. Here are some things you can use to practice before I start giving you lessons.
I looked in the box. It was full of knives.
My parents would kill me,
I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch.
I'd be spanked and grounded for a year.
Mr. Widemouth frowned.
It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it.
I pushed the box away.
I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air.
Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took one of the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there for the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night, saying he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me.
I have something I want you to see,
he said. I must have given him a weird look because he then said,
It's safe, I promise.
I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind the house.
This is an important path. I've had a lot of friends your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day I hope to take you there.
I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last load of our things had been packed into a moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps this creature's intents were not to my benefit, despite what he said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck at 4 a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a man who was about to run a marathon rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still.
Early enough for you?
He asked. I nodded and placed my head against the window, hoping for some sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder.
This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's hard for you, as sick as you've been. Once Daddy gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends.
I opened my eyes and we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave a pitiful little goodbye, steak knife in hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house burnt down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out from behind a tree and scare the living bejesus out of me. But I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belong to children.